China is sitting on $3.2 trillion in US dollar assets. Treasury bonds, corporate bonds, currency reserves, mortgage-backed securities. That is more dollar exposure than any other nation on earth. More than Japan, more than the UK, more than all of Europe combined. And for years you've heard analysts, politicians, and the financial media screaming about the same threat. What if China dumps it all? What if they decide to weaponize their treasury holdings and flood the market with sell orders? The dollar would crash, interest rates would spike, the US government would face a funding crisis, American economic dominance would end overnight. It's been called the nuclear option, the financial weapon of mass destruction, the ace up China's sleeve that keeps American policymakers awake at night. But here's what nobody tells you. China can't use it. Not won't. Can't. Because the moment they pull that trigger, they destroy themselves. They don't just damage their economy, they completely annihilate it. That $3.2 trillion isn't a weapon, it's a trap. And both the United States and China are locked inside it with no way out. This is the most sophisticated financial hostage situation in history. Two superpowers, each holding a gun to the other's head, both knowing that pulling the trigger means mutual destruction. And what makes this terrifying isn't the threat of what might happen. It's the slow-motion unraveling that is already happening right now. Because China knows they're trapped. And they've been quietly trying to escape for the last 15 years, buying gold, building alternative payment systems, shifting their economy away from dollar dependence. But the trap is so deep, the exposure so massive, that escape takes decades. And the question isn't whether they'll get out, it's whether the trap collapses before they do. Let me show you exactly how this trap works, why it's inescapable, and what is happening right now as both nations try to navigate their way out without triggering mutual annihilation. Start with the weapon itself, China's dollar holdings. As of July 2025, China holds approximately $731 billion in US Treasury securities. That's the official number reported by the US Treasury Department. And here's what is significant. That's the lowest level since January 2009, 16 years. China has been systematically reducing Treasury holdings for years, and in July 2025 alone, they cut $25.7 billion. This wasn't a small trim, and this was the steepest single-month reduction in nearly 2 years. And it pushed China from second to third place among foreign treasury holders. Japan still holds $1.15 trillion. The UK holds $899 billion. China dropped to third. But that isn't the full picture, not even close. China also holds massive positions in US corporate bonds, technology companies, financial institutions, industrial corporations. Estimates put this at $300 billion to $500 billion. They hold US dollars as foreign exchange reserves, not invested in bonds, just sitting as currency. Another $500 billion to $700 billion. They hold US mortgage-backed securities, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the same securities that nearly destroyed the global economy in 2008. China bought hundreds of billions of these after the crisis when they were cheap. Current holdings estimated at $200 billion. They hold equity positions in US companies through sovereign wealth funds and state-owned enterprises. BlackRock estimates Chinese state-linked entities hold between $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion in total US equity exposure. Add it all together: treasuries, corporate bonds, currency reserves, mortgage securities, equities. The total dollar exposure is somewhere between $2.8 trillion and $3.5 trillion. The commonly cited figure is $3.2 trillion. Not because it's exact, but because it's the midpoint estimate that most analysts agree represents China's total dollar trap. Now here is why this number matters. It isn't just large, it's structural. It isn't money China can easily move. It's embedded in their entire economic system. China accumulated these dollars over 40 years through one mechanism: trade surplus. From the 1980s through the 2010s, China ran the largest sustained trade surplus in modern history. They exported manufactured goods to the world: electronics, textiles, machinery, toys, furniture, everything. The world paid for these goods in dollars. Chinese exporters received dollars, exchanged them for yuan at Chinese banks, and the banks forwarded those dollars to the People's Bank of China. The central bank then had to do something with trillions of dollars flowing in every year. They couldn't just hold cash. Cash earns no return and loses value to inflation, so they invested it. US Treasury bonds were the obvious choice. Safest asset in the world, largest, most liquid bond market, backed by the US government's taxing power. And critically, buying treasuries served another purpose. It kept the yuan weak. Every time China bought treasuries, they were selling yuan and buying dollars. This kept yuan undervalued relative to the dollar. And undervalued, yuan made Chinese exports cheaper for American consumers. Cheaper exports meant more sales. More sales meant more dollars flowing into China. More dollars meant more treasury purchases. It was a self-reinforcing cycle. China's export economy was built on this mechanism. The $3.2 trillion in dollar holdings isn't separate from China's economic model. It is the economic model. Those dollars are the accumulated result of 40 years of export-driven growth. They represent the savings of an entire nation. And that's the first layer of the trap. Now let's talk about the fantasy, the scenario that politicians and analysts love to fearmonger about. What if China dumps all $3.2 trillion? Here's how it would theoretically work. China calls up their bond traders and issues the order, sell everything. All $731 billion in treasuries hit the market simultaneously. The treasury market, normally the most liquid in the world, would seize up. You can't absorb $731 billion in sell orders without massive price impact. Bond prices would collapse. When bond prices fall, yields rise. The 10-year treasury yield, currently around 4.5%, would spike to 8%, maybe 10%, maybe higher, depending on panic levels. That's the immediate effect. But the cascade doesn't stop there. US mortgage rates are priced off the 10-year treasury. If the 10-year yield hits 10%, mortgage rates hit 13% to 14%. The housing market freezes. Nobody can afford a mortgage at 14%. Home prices collapse. Consumer spending, which is 70% of the US economy, falls off a cliff because home equity is America's primary source of wealth. Corporate borrowing becomes impossible. Companies that need to refinance debt face 12% to 15% interest rates. Many can't pay. Defaults surge. Credit markets seize. Banks that hold treasuries as assets see the value of those assets collapse. Their balance sheets implode. Banking crisis. The Federal Reserve would be forced to intervene. They'd have to buy the bonds China is dumping to stabilize the market. But buying $731 billion in treasuries means printing $731 billion. That's monetary expansion on a scale not seen outside of wartime. Inflation, which the Fed spent years trying to control, explodes again. The dollar's value collapses in foreign exchange markets. As the dollar falls, import prices surge. Everything Americans buy from abroad, electronics, cars, clothing, food, doubles in price. Inflation hits 20%, maybe 30% annually. The economy enters stagflation. High inflation, high unemployment, collapsing growth. And here's the kicker. US government borrowing costs explode. The government currently pays about $1 trillion per year in interest on the national debt. If yields double, interest costs hit $2 trillion. That's more than the defense budget, Medicare, and a significant chunk of Social Security combined. The government would face a funding crisis. They'd have to cut spending massively or print money to cover the gap. Either choice accelerates the crisis. This is the nightmare scenario. The financial nuclear weapon. China pushes the button and the US economy implodes. Except here's the reality. The moment China dumps those treasuries, China destroys itself even faster. Then they destroy the US. Let me show you exactly why. Start with the most immediate effect. The dollar collapses. When China floods the market with $731 billion in treasuries and starts selling dollar reserves, the dollar's value in foreign exchange markets plummets. Let's say the dollar loses 30% of its value against other currencies in a matter of weeks. That sounds catastrophic for the US, and it is. But it's even more catastrophic for China because China still holds the other $2.5 trillion in dollar-denominated assets, corporate bonds, mortgage securities, currency reserves, equity positions. The moment the dollar loses 30% of its value, China just lost 30% on $2.5 trillion. That's $750 billion in losses. Gone. Evaporated in a matter of weeks. China's central bank balance sheet, which is supposed to back the yuan, just took a $750 billion hit. For context, China's foreign exchange reserves are about $3.34 trillion total as of September 2025. A $750 billion loss is 22% of their entire reserve base. That isn't a rounding error, that's a solvency crisis. But the damage doesn't stop there. China's economy is built on exports. 20% of China's GDP comes from exports, and the largest destination for those exports is the United States. $500 billion in goods shipped to America annually. When the dollar collapses and the US economy enters crisis, American consumers stop buying Chinese goods. Demand evaporates. Chinese factories that depend on US orders shut down. Unemployment in China's export sectors spikes. But here's the worst part. Even if Americans wanted to keep buying Chinese goods, they can't afford them anymore. Because when the dollar collapses, the yuan surges. If the dollar loses 30% of its value, the yuan gains 43% relative to the dollar. Chinese goods just became 43% more expensive for American buyers overnight. But the real killer is what happens to China's domestic economy. China's financial system is built on dollar liquidity. Chinese banks borrow dollars internationally to fund domestic lending. Chinese corporations issue dollar-denominated bonds because dollar interest rates are lower than yuan rates. When the dollar collapses and US interest rates spiked to 10%, every Chinese company and bank that borrowed in dollars faces a refinancing crisis. They owe dollars, but their revenue is in yuan. The yuan just surged 43%. Their debt just became 43% more expensive to service. Chinese corporate debt is $28 trillion. About $3 trillion of that is dollar-denominated. A 43% currency move means Chinese corporations now owe an additional $1.3 trillion in real terms. Most can't pay. Defaults cascade. Chinese banks that lent to these corporations or hold their bonds face massive losses. Banking crisis in China. The government would have to bail out the banks, but they just lost $750 billion on their dollar reserves. They don't have the resources. They'd have to print yuan to cover the losses. That's monetary expansion. Inflation in China, which the government has kept under control through strict policy, explodes. Chinese citizens who hold most of their wealth in real estate and yuan-denominated savings see their purchasing power evaporate. Social unrest. And here's the final nail. China imports almost all of its energy. Oil, natural gas, coal. These are priced in dollars globally. When the dollar collapses but oil is still priced in dollars, China has to pay more yuan for the same amount of energy. Energy costs double. This feeds directly into inflation. Chinese manufacturing, which depends on cheap energy, becomes uncompetitive. The entire economy grinds down. So let's add it up. China dumps $3.2 trillion in dollar assets. In the process, they lose $750 billion on the remaining holdings. Their export economy collapses because American demand disappears and yuan surge makes them uncompetitive. Their corporate sector faces a debt crisis from currency mismatch. Their banks implode. Their government is forced to print money. Inflation spikes, energy costs double, social unrest begins, and all of this happens faster than the damage to the US because China's economy is more fragile. The US has the world's deepest capital markets, the most diversified economy, and the Federal Reserve, which can print dollars to stabilize the system. China has none of these advantages. The yuan is not a global reserve currency. Nobody wants to hold yuan during a crisis. China's capital markets are smaller and state-controlled. Their economy is dependent on exports and external energy. When the dollar trap explodes, China is destroyed faster than the US. This is why the $3.2 trillion isn't a weapon. It's a hostage situation where China is holding themselves hostage. The nuclear option is a gun pointed at their own head, and both sides know it. So if China can't dump the dollars, what are they actually doing? They're trying to escape the trap slowly, very slowly, over decades. And the strategy has three components. First, gold. Second, alternative payment systems. China has been building infrastructure to conduct international trade without using dollars. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, launched in 2015. It's China's alternative to SWIFT, the dollar-based system that handles most global transactions. CIPS allows Chinese banks and foreign banks to settle transactions in yuan without touching the dollar system. As of 2025, CIPS processes about 14 trillion in transactions annually. That's still small compared to SWIFT's $150 trillion, but it's growing 30% per year. China has also been signing bilateral currency swap agreements with dozens of countries. These agreements allow direct yuan for local currency exchanges without converting through dollars. China has swap lines with Russia, Brazil, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Pakistan, and 35 other nations. Total value exceeds 500 billion. The goal is to create a yuan trade bloc, where Chinese imports and exports are priced and settled in yuan, not dollars. If China buys oil from Saudi Arabia in yuan, and Saudi Arabia uses those yuan to buy Chinese manufactured goods, the entire transaction bypasses the dollar. No dollar demand, no need to hold dollar reserves. This is the long-term escape plan. Shift enough trade into yuan that China's export economy no longer depends on dollar accumulation. But here's the problem. This takes decades. You can't force the world to use yuan. They use yuan only if it's advantageous. And right now, for most countries, dollars are still more convenient. Dollars are accepted everywhere. Dollar markets are deeper. Dollar contracts are enforceable under US law, which most countries trust more than Chinese law. So the shift happens slowly, a few percentage points per year. China's share of global trade settled in yuan has grown from 2% in 2015 to about 7% in 2025. That's progress, but at this rate it'll take 30 years to get to 50%. And China doesn't have 30 years because the dollar trap is active right now. Third, internal consumption shift. China is trying to rebalance their economy away from export dependence toward domestic consumption. If Chinese citizens consume more of what China produces, then China needs fewer export dollars. This has been official policy since 2013. The government wants consumption to rise from 38% of GDP to 60% of GDP over 20 years. They've built infrastructure, expanded social services, raised wages, and tried to shift the economy from investment and exports to consumption and services, and it's working slowly. Consumption's share of GDP has risen from 38% in 2010 to 55% in 2025. But this creates a new problem. As Chinese wages rise, Chinese exports become less competitive. The whole reason China dominated global manufacturing was cheap labor. When labor costs rise, factories move to Vietnam, Bangladesh, Mexico. China's trade surplus, which peaked at $400 billion annually in 2015, has fallen to $250 billion in 2025. That means fewer dollars flowing in, which sounds like escape from the dollar trap. Except China still holds $3.2 trillion in existing dollar assets. The trap doesn't shrink just because new dollars stop flowing in. China needs to actively reduce the $3.2 trillion, but they can't sell without crashing the dollar. So they're stuck. The internal consumption shift reduces future dollar accumulation, but it doesn't solve the existing trap. Now let's talk about the timeline. How long does this escape attempt take, and what does it mean for the dollar? China started this process in 2008, after the financial crisis. That was the moment Chinese leadership realized the dollar system was fragile, and they were overexposed. 17 years later, in 2025, they've made progress. Gold reserves up from 600 tons to officially 2,233 tons, likely 5,000 to 6,000 tons in reality. Yuan's share of trade up from 0% to 7%. Dollar treasury reserves down from 1.3 trillion in 2013 to 731 billion in July 2025. trade surplus shifting from exports to consumption, but they're only about 25% of the way to full escape. At the current pace, full diversification takes another 20 to 30 years. We're talking 2045 to 2055 before China's dollar exposure drops below $1 trillion, the level where dumping becomes feasible without self-destruction. But here's the critical question. Does the system last that long? Because China isn't the only variable. The US is accumulating debt at $2 trillion per year. As of November 2025, US national debt stands at $38 trillion. Interest costs are approaching $1 trillion annually. That's 14% of total federal spending. The Fed has printed trillions. Inflation persists. The dollar's reserve currency status is eroding, not because China is attacking it, but because the US is debasing it from within. If the dollar collapses on its own before China escapes the trap, China takes catastrophic losses. This is the race. Can China diversify out of dollars before the dollar collapses under its own weight? Right now the answer is no. The timeline doesn't work. China needs 20 years. The dollar's structural problems suggest crisis within 5 to 10 years, which means China is trapped. They can't dump dollars without destroying themselves. They can't hold dollars without being destroyed when the dollar collapses. It's a lose-lose scenario. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The US is trapped too. American policymakers understand China holds $3.2 trillion. They know China could theoretically dump it, so US policy is constrained. The US can't be too aggressive with China because China could retaliate financially. This is why sanctions on China are limited compared to sanctions on Russia. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the US froze $280 billion in Russian dollar reserves. Just took them. Russia couldn't access their own money. It was the most aggressive financial weapon the US has ever used, but the US can't do that to China. Why? Because China holds $3.2 trillion. If the US froze Chinese dollar assets, China would have nothing to lose. They'd dump everything immediately. Sure, they'd destroy themselves in the process, but they'd take the US down with them. Mutually assured destruction. So the US has to be careful. They can't push China too hard. They can't freeze assets. They can't cut China out of SWIFT. They can't use the full range of financial weapons available. China's dollar holdings act as a deterrent, not a weapon they can use offensively, but a constraint on US action. And China knows this. It's why they haven't diversified faster. If China sold $500 billion in treasuries over 1 year, markets would panic. The US would interpret it as an attack. Relations would collapse. Sanctions would follow. China would lose access to US technology, US markets, US financial systems. The economic damage would exceed whatever they gained from escaping the dollar trap. So, both sides are stuck. China can't dump dollars without destroying themselves and triggering US retaliation. The US can't weaponize the dollar against China without triggering a financial crisis that destroys the US. It's the most sophisticated standoff in financial history, and it's completely invisible to most people because both sides pretend it doesn't exist. Here's what this means for the dollar. The slow-motion escape China is attempting actually supports the dollar in the short term. Every year, China buys fewer treasuries, but they're not selling existing holdings aggressively. They cut $25.7 billion in July 2025, which sounds like a lot, but it's measured, controlled. That means demand for treasuries is declining gradually, not collapsing suddenly. US interest rates rise slowly over time rather than spiking. This is manageable for the US. The Federal Reserve can adjust. Markets can adapt. It's not a crisis, it's a slow erosion. But the slow erosion has a tipping point. At some point, usually when dollar reserves fall below 50% of global central bank reserves, confidence breaks. Other countries see China reducing dollars, and follow the shift accelerates. What was gradual becomes rapid. That's when the dollar loses reserve status, not through Chinese attack, through market dynamics. Right now, the dollar's share of global reserves is 56.3% to 57.7%, depending on the quarter in 2025. Down from 58% in 2024, down from 72% in 2000. That's a 14 to 16 percentage point decline over 25 years. At that rate, the dollar hits 50% around 2030 to 2032, but the rate is accelerating. The last few years have seen faster decline. If that pace continues, 50% could be reached by 2028. And here's the key. Once the dollar falls below 50%, the question changes from will the dollar remain the reserve currency to what replaces it. That's when BRICS currencies, gold-backed systems, and regional currency blocks become viable. That's when the shift accelerates into crisis. And China doesn't need to do anything. They just keep executing their slow diversification, and the dollar's structural problems do the rest. Now, let me show you the ultimate irony. Both nations are trapped. But the trap was created by mutual benefit. For 40 years, from 1980 to 2020, the dollar-China relationship was win-win. China got to industrialize rapidly by exporting to the US. Hundreds of millions lifted out of poverty. China became the world's second-largest economy. The US got cheap manufactured goods, Walmart shelves stocked with $20 toasters and $50 televisions. American consumers' purchasing power increased, even as wages stagnated because everything became cheaper. US corporations got massive profits by offshoring production to China. Apple, Nike, GM, everyone. The stock market boomed. The US government got cheap financing. China recycled trade surplus dollars into treasuries, keeping US interest rates low. This allowed the US to run massive deficits without consequence. Both sides benefited enormously. But the mechanism that created the benefit also created the trap. China's industrialization required dollar accumulation. The US's cheap goods required Chinese production. The interdependence became so deep that neither side could exit without destroying the system that benefited them. And now, 40 years later, the system is breaking down. China's labor costs are rising. Their exports are less competitive. The US's debt is unsustainable. Interest costs are exploding. The benefits are declining. But the trap remains. Both sides want out, but neither can leave without catastrophic cost. This is the financial equivalent of two mountain climbers roped together on a cliff. Face if one falls, both die. So they're both trying to find new anchors, new positions, new ways to secure themselves independently. But the process takes years and the cliff is crumbling. The question isn't whether both sides recognize the trap. They do. Every central banker, every finance minister, every economist understands the situation. The question is whether they can escape before the cliff collapses. Here's what happens next. Over the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see China continue the slow diversification. More gold purchases, more UN trade agreements, more internal consumption. You'll see the US continue debasing the dollar. More deficit spending, more Fed money printing, more inflation. You'll see the dollar's reserve status continue eroding. 57% today, 50% by 2028, maybe 40% by 2032. And at some point during this process, one of three things happens. First possibility, orderly transition. The dollar remains a major currency, but not the dominant reserve. The world shifts to a multipolar currency system. Yuan for Asia, Euro for Europe, dollar for the Americas. No crisis, just gradual adjustment. This is the optimistic scenario. It requires competent management by both US and Chinese leadership, stable geopolitics, and no major economic shocks. Probability, maybe 20%. Second possibility, crisis transition. A triggering event, debt ceiling breach, major bank failure, geopolitical conflict causes a sudden loss of confidence. China is forced to dump dollars defensively. The US retaliates. Mutual destruction scenario plays out. Global financial crisis, depression, currency chaos. This stabilizes eventually, but only after massive wealth destruction. Probability, maybe 50%. Third possibility, the trap collapses on both. The dollar's internal problems, debt, deficits, inflation, cause collapse before China escapes. China takes catastrophic losses on their $3.2 trillion, their economy implodes. US economy also implodes from dollar collapse. But because China was still trapped, they're hit worse. Both nations enter prolonged economic crisis simultaneously. No winner, both losers. Probability may be 30%. None of these scenarios are good. The best case is managed decline, the worst case is mutual annihilation, and the most likely case is somewhere between chaotic crisis and mutual destruction. Here's what you need to understand. This isn't about picking sides. It's not US versus China. It's about recognizing that the two largest economies in the world are locked in a financial structure that benefits neither, but traps both. And that structure is unstable. The $3.2 trillion isn't a weapon China can use against the US. It's a liability both nations are stuck with, and as the dollar continues to weaken, as US debt continues to grow from $38 trillion onward, as China continues trying to escape, the instability increases. You're watching the slow-motion collapse of the financial architecture that defined the last 40 years. And when that architecture fails, it doesn't matter whether you were rooting for the US or China, your savings, your investments, your purchasing power, all of it is denominated in currencies caught in this trap. The dollar will lose value. The yuan will be volatile. And the transition, however it plays out, will destroy wealth on a scale not seen since the 1930s. This is why understanding the trap matters, not because you can change the outcome, you can't, but because you can position yourself outside the trap. Gold, Bitcoin, hard assets, productive businesses, these exist outside the dollar hostage situation. When both currencies are trapped, you need to hold things that aren't. The $3.2 trillion trap is the most important financial dynamic in the world right now, and almost nobody is paying attention, because both governments are pretending it doesn't exist. China doesn't talk about it, because admitting the trap shows weakness. The US doesn't talk about it because acknowledging China's leverage creates panic. So both sides stay quiet, keep executing their slow strategies, and hope they can navigate out before the cliff collapses. But the cliff is crumbling and the timeline is running out. If this changed how you see the US-China relationship, if you finally understand why neither side can win this standoff, then you're starting to see the real structure of global finance. Not the stories politicians tell, not the fears media sells, the actual mechanics of the trap. Subscribe if you want to track how this plays out, because over the next 5 years this trap will either slowly release or catastrophically collapse. And either way, it's the most important financial story of the decade. Next video, I'm going to show you exactly what China's buying with the dollars they're quietly moving out of treasuries. It's not just gold. There are 3 other assets they're accumulating that almost nobody's tracking. And understanding what they're buying tells you exactly where smart money thinks value will be when the dollar trap finally breaks.